The idea had been Josh's, naturally. He was always the one pushing them to do things they probably shouldn't. This time, it was the old fun zone, abandoned for years after what happened. Nobody talked about that anymore. "Come on," Josh had said, his eyes gleaming with that familiar daredevil light. "It'll be awesome, like a real-life horror movie." Sarah had been hesitant, but it's supposed to be, dangerous, and probably full of spiders. Mark, ever the follower, just shrugged. "I'm in if you guys are." That left Ben. Ben wasn't thrilled. He'd heard the stories, the whispers about kids disappearing at the fun zone, about strange noises and shadows, but he also didn't want to be the chicken. So, here they were, huddled outside the rusted fence of the fun zone, the moon casting long, eerie shadows across the overgrown parking lot. The air felt heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something faintly metallic and unpleasant. Josh easily scaled the fence, tearing a small hole in his jeans. "Piece of cake. Come on, slowpokes." Sarah went next, her face pale in the moonlight. Mark followed, his usual bravado replaced with a nervous fidgeting. Ben took a deep breath and climbed, his heart pounding in his chest. He told himself it was just the adrenaline, just a dumb dare, but a nagging feeling, a cold dread, settled in his stomach. He couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone, that something was watching them from the darkness. This wasn't going to be fun. This was going to be something else entirely, something bad. The inside of the fun zone was worse than Ben imagined. The air was thick with dust, making him cough. Moonlight filtered through grimy windows, painting the scene in shades of gray and black. The once brightly colored walls were now peeling and stained, covered in strange dark streaks that looked almost like claw marks. A large plastic slide, once a vibrant yellow, was now coated in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. It looked like it hadn't been used in decades. Rusted metal supports groaned in the wind, creating an eerie soundtrack to their adventure. In one corner, a pile of discarded party hats lay scattered like fallen leaves, their once cheerful colors faded and muted. But the worst part was the ball pit. It was enormous, taking up almost half the room. The plastic balls, once a rainbow of colors, were now dull and faded, many cracked and broken. A thick layer of grime coated everything, and the air around it seemed to shimmer with an unnatural stillness. It smelled like old plastic and something else, something rotten. Ben shivered, pulling his jacket tighter around him. "I don't like this," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the creaking of the building. Josh, ever the showman, just laughed. "Relax, Ben. It's just a bit spooky. Come on, let's check it out." He grabbed a discarded broom and poked at the edge of the ball pit. A cloud of dust erupted, making Sarah cough. "Ew, gross," she exclaimed, waving her hand in front of her face. Mark, trying to appear brave, took a tentative step closer to the pit. "Maybe there's treasure in there," he said, his voice a little too loud, a little too forced. Ben stayed back, his eyes fixed on the ball pit. It seemed to pulse with a dark energy, a silent promise of something terrible. He had a feeling that treasure was the last thing they would find in there. Josh, still trying to lighten the mood, pretended to be a pirate, waving the broom like a sword. "Ahoy, mateys, prepare to be boarded." He stumbled over a loose floorboard, nearly falling into the ball pit. "Careful, Josh." Sarah giggled nervously. "You don't want to end up swimming in that thing." Mark joined in, kicking a few of the plastic balls. They made a hollow, echoing sound as they bounced against the walls. "Yeah, who knows what's lurking down there? Maybe mutant spiders." Ben didn't laugh. He was too busy listening. He could have sworn he heard something, a faint scratching sound coming from deep within the ball pit. It was almost imperceptible, like nails dragging across plastic. "Did you guys hear that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Hear what?" Josh said, still playing around. I think there's something in the ball pit," Ben said, his eyes wide with fear. Sarah and Mark exchanged nervous glances. The joking stopped. Even Josh seemed to sober up a bit. "Don't be ridiculous, Ben," Josh said, trying to sound confident, but Ben could hear the tremor in his voice. "It's probably just rats." "Rats don't scratch like that," Ben insisted, his gaze fixed on the still, silent surface of the ball pit. The scratching sound had stopped, but the feeling of being watched had intensified. He felt like something was down there, listening, waiting. Suddenly, a gust of wind rattled the windows, making them all jump. A shadow flickered across the wall, and for a moment, Ben thought he saw something move in the ball pit. Something large, something dark. "Okay," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Maybe we should go. This place is giving me the creeps." Mark nodded in agreement. "Yeah, I'm not feeling so good either." Even Josh seemed ready to leave. All right, let's not be heroes. We can always come back another time, maybe." But as they turned to leave, Ben heard it again. The scratching sound, louder this time, closer. And then, a faint whisper, barely audible above the wind. A whisper that seemed to come from the very depths of the ball pit. "Help me." The whisper hung in the air, chilling them to the bone. Sarah gasped, clutching Josh's arm. Mark took a step back, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "Did you hear that?" Ben asked, his voice trembling. "Yeah," Sarah whispered, her face pale. "I definitely heard something." Josh, trying to regain control of the situation, scoffed. "It was probably just the wind. This place is old, remember?" But even he didn't sound convinced. The "help me" had been too clear, too desperate. Suddenly, the scratching started again, louder this time, more frantic. It was accompanied by a low, guttural moan that seemed to vibrate through the floor. The plastic balls in the pit began to shift and swirl, as if something was moving beneath them. "Okay, that's it," Sarah said, her voice rising in panic. "I'm leaving." She turned to run, but Josh grabbed her arm. "Wait, we can't just leave. What if someone really is trapped down there?" "Trapped?" Mark said, his eyes wide with disbelief. "How could anyone be trapped in a ball pit?" "I don't know," Josh snapped, "but we can't just ignore it." Ben, despite his fear, felt a pang of guilt. What if someone really needed their help? He took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. Maybe we should take a look," he said, his voice barely audible. Sarah and Mark stared at him in disbelief. "Are you crazy, Ben?" Sarah exclaimed. "We're getting out of here." But Josh seemed to consider it. He looked at the ball pit, his expression a mixture of fear and determination. "All right," he said, his voice low and serious. "We'll take a quick look, but if things get too weird, we're out of here. Got it?" Sarah and Mark reluctantly nodded. Ben knew this was a terrible idea. He knew something bad was going to happen, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they had to do something. They couldn't just leave someone to suffer, even if that someone was trapped in a nightmare. Slowly, cautiously, they approached the ball pit. The air around it seemed to grow colder, and the rotten smell intensified. Ben felt a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, as if something was watching them from below. Josh grabbed the broom again and used it to push aside some of the plastic balls, creating a small opening. The balls shifted sluggishly, revealing a dark, gaping hole beneath. It was impossible to see what lay at the bottom. "Hello?" Josh called out, his voice wavering slightly. "Is anyone down there?" Silence. Only the creaking of the building and the rustling of the wind answered him. "Maybe it was nothing," Sarah said, her voice filled with a desperate hope. "Maybe we imagined it." But then they heard it, a faint, muffled sound coming from the depths of the pit. It was hard to tell what it was. Was it crying or screaming? It was a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. "Oh my gosh," Mark whispered, his face ashen. "What is that?" The sound grew louder, more distinct. It was definitely screaming, a high-pitched, desperate scream that sent shivers down their spines. "Help me, please, someone help me." The voice cried out, barely audible above the wind. "We have to do something," Ben said, his voice filled with a newfound determination. He couldn't just stand there and listen to someone suffer. He took a step closer to the edge of the pit, peering into the darkness. The rotten smell was almost overwhelming now, and he could feel a strange, almost magnetic pull drawing him closer. "Hello?" Ben shouted into the darkness. "We're here to help. Can you hear us?" The screaming stopped abruptly. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a new sound emerged from the depths of the pit. A low, guttural chuckle that was far more terrifying than any scream. "Help you," a raspy voice whispered. "Oh, I don't need your help. I want you to join me." The raspy voice sent a jolt of fear through Ben. He stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. What did it say? Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "It wants us to join it," Ben replied, his voice trembling. "Join it?" Mark repeated, his face pale. "Join it where? In that thing?" Josh shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. "Okay, this is getting way too weird. We're leaving. Now." He turned to go, but Sarah grabbed his arm. "Wait, what about the person who was screaming? We can't just leave them." "There is no person," Josh insisted, his voice rising in panic. "Don't you get it? That thing is trying to trick us." But Sarah wouldn't budge. "I heard someone scream, Josh. I can't just ignore that." Before Josh could argue, Mark took a tentative step towards the ball pit. Maybe we should just take a quick peek, just to make sure." "Are you crazy?" Josh exclaimed. "Have you lost your mind?" But Mark was already moving closer, drawn by a morbid curiosity. He peered into the darkness, his eyes struggling to adjust to the lack of light. "I can't see anything," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's just darkness." He leaned further forward, trying to get a better look. The rotten smell filled his nostrils, and he felt a strange tingling sensation on his skin. Suddenly, a hand shot out from the depths of the pit, grabbing Mark's wrist with surprising force. Mark screamed, his eyes wide with terror. "Help me, it's got me." The hand pulled him forward, towards the darkness. Mark struggled, kicking and screaming, but the grip was too strong. "Help me, please, someone help me," he cried out, his voice fading as he was pulled deeper into the ball pit. Ben and Sarah stood frozen in horror, unable to react. They watched as Mark disappeared into the darkness, swallowed by the pit of plastic balls. The only sound was Mark's fading screams and the low, guttural chuckle that seemed to echo from the very depths of the earth. Ben finally snapped out of his paralysis. He lunged towards the ball pit, reaching for Mark, but it was too late. Mark was gone, swallowed by the darkness. Only the faint echo of his screams lingered in the air. "Mark!" Sarah screamed, tears streaming down her face. "Oh my God, Mark." "We have to get him out," Ben shouted, his voice filled with a desperate urgency. He grabbed the broom and frantically began to push aside the plastic balls, trying to find where Mark had disappeared. Josh, his face pale with shock, finally regained his composure. "Ben, stop. It's too dangerous. We have to get out of here." "I'm not leaving him," Ben yelled, ignoring Josh's warning. He continued to dig through the balls, his hands trembling with fear and adrenaline. Sarah, despite her terror, joined him, desperately trying to help. Together, they cleared a large section of the ball pit, revealing a gaping hole that seemed to lead down into endless darkness. "Mark, can you hear us?" Ben shouted into the hole, his voice hoarse. No answer. Only the low, guttural chuckle echoed from the depths below. Suddenly, the plastic balls around them began to vibrate, as if something was moving beneath them. The rotten smell intensified, filling their nostrils with a sickening stench. "Ben, I don't like this," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "I think we should go." But Ben was determined to find Mark, no matter the risk. He ignored Sarah's plea and lowered himself into the hole, clinging to the edge of the pit with one hand. "Mark, where are you?" he shouted, his voice echoing in the darkness. As he dangled there, peering into the abyss, he felt a cold, clammy hand grab his ankle. He screamed, his heart leaping into his throat. He tried to pull himself back up, but the hand was too strong. It began to pull him down, into the darkness. "Help me," Ben cried out, his voice filled with terror. "Josh, Sarah, help me." But it was too late. The hand pulled him down, into the darkness, into the abyss. His screams were cut short as he disappeared into the depths of the ball pit, leaving Sarah alone in the eerie silence of the abandoned fun zone. The low chuckle echoed once more, then faded into the darkness, leaving her alone with her terror. Sarah stood frozen, paralyzed by fear. She watched in horror as Ben disappeared into the hole, his screams cut short. She was alone, utterly, terrifyingly alone. But then she heard Josh shout, "Sarah, grab my hand. We have to get out of here." His voice snapped her out of her trance. She turned to see Josh standing near the entrance, his face pale but determined. He held out his hand to her. With trembling legs, Sarah stumbled towards him. She reached out and grabbed his hand, clinging to it as if it were a lifeline. "Come on," Josh urged, pulling her towards the exit. "We have to go, now." They ran as fast as they could, their footsteps echoing in the eerie silence of the fun zone. They didn't look back. They didn't dare. As they reached the fence, Josh quickly scaled it, helping Sarah over after him. They landed on the other side, gasping for breath. They didn't stop running. They ran until they were far away from the fun zone, far away from the darkness, far away from the chilling chuckle that still echoed in their minds. Finally, they collapsed on a nearby park bench, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and fear. They sat in silence for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. "They're gone," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Mark and Ben, they're gone." Josh put his arm around her, offering her what little comfort he could. "I know," he said, his voice hoarse. "I know." They sat there for a long time, huddled together in the darkness. They knew they should call the police, tell someone what had happened. But they were afraid of what the police would say. Afraid of what might happen if they went back to the fun zone. And most of all, they were afraid of what might have followed them out. They couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone, that something was still watching them, waiting for them in the darkness. The playful, brightly colored balls now seemed like symbols of something sinister, something evil. They would never look at a ball pit the same way again. The laughter of children now sounded like a distant scream. They were forever changed. Josh tried to convince himself it was just a nightmare, that they'd wake up and Mark and Ben would be there, laughing about how scared they'd been. But he knew it wasn't true. He'd seen Mark disappear. He'd heard Ben scream. He glanced at Sarah. She was staring straight ahead, her eyes wide and unblinking. He knew she was replaying the events in her mind, over and over again. He could almost hear the screams echoing in her head. "We have to tell someone," he said finally, breaking the silence. "We have to tell the police." Sarah flinched. "No, I can't go back there, I can't." "We have to," Josh insisted. "What if it happens again? What if someone else goes in there?" "But what if it followed us?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "What if it's here, right now?" Josh shivered. He tried to dismiss the thought, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced around the park, his eyes scanning the shadows. Suddenly, a street lamp flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. Sarah gasped, clutching Josh's arm. "See?" she whispered, her voice filled with terror. "It's here." Josh pulled out his phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. "It's just a power outage," he said, trying to reassure her. "It's nothing." But even as he spoke, he heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from behind them. He quickly turned around, shining the flashlight in the direction of the sound. "Nothing. Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "It's getting closer," she whispered. They stood frozen, listening intently. The scratching sound grew louder, more distinct. It was accompanied by a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground. "We have to go," Josh said, his voice trembling. "We have to get out of here." They stood up and began to run, their hearts pounding in their chests. They didn't know where they were going, but they knew they had to get away. They had to get away from the darkness, from the scratching sound, from the growling, from the feeling that something was hunting them. They ran for their lives, praying that they could escape the nightmare that had followed them out of the fun zone. They ran through the streets, their breath coming in ragged gasps. They didn't know where they were going. They just knew they had to get away. The scratching and growling seemed to fade behind them, but the feeling of being watched remained. Finally, they reached Josh's house. He fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely get the key in the lock. "Come on," he urged, pushing the door open. "Hurry." They rushed inside, slamming the door behind them and locking it. Josh leaned against the door, his chest heaving. "We're safe now," he said, trying to convince himself as much as Sarah. "It can't get in here." But Sarah wasn't so sure. She glanced around the living room, her eyes darting nervously from shadow to shadow. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out. The house was plunged into darkness. Sarah screamed, grabbing Josh's arm. "It's here," she shrieked. "I know it is." Josh pulled out his phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam of light danced around the room, revealing nothing but familiar furniture and shadows. "It's just another power outage," he said, trying to sound calm. "It'll be okay." But then they heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from inside the house. It seemed to be coming from the hallway. Josh slowly turned, shining the flashlight down the hallway. The beam of light illuminated a row of closed doors. The scratching sound grew louder, more distinct. It was accompanied by a low, guttural growl that seemed to be coming from under one of the doors. Josh's heart pounded in his chest. He knew what was behind that door. He knew what was waiting for them. He slowly approached the door, his hand trembling as he reached for the doorknob. He took a deep breath and turned the knob. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, empty room, or so it seemed. As Josh shone the flashlight into the room, He saw it. A pile of brightly colored plastic balls scattered across the floor, the balls from the fun zone. Sarah screamed, backing away from the door. No, it can't be. Suddenly, the plastic balls began to shift and swirl, as if something was moving beneath them. The scratching sound grew louder, more frantic. A hand shot out from the pile of balls, grabbing Josh's ankle. He screamed, dropping the flashlight. The light went out, plunging them into darkness. Sarah screamed again, her voice filled with terror. She heard Josh struggling, fighting against something she couldn't see. Then, silence. She fumbled for her own phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam of light revealed nothing but a pile of scattered plastic balls. Josh was gone. Sarah stood alone in the darkness, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she was next. She knew it was coming for her. She closed her eyes, bracing herself for the end. But it never came. After what felt like an eternity, she waited, her flashlight beam trembling in her hand. The silence stretched on, broken only by the frantic pounding of her heart. She was sure it was coming back. Sure she was about to meet the same fate as Mark, Ben, and Josh. But nothing happened. Slowly, cautiously, she opened her eyes. The plastic balls were still scattered across the floor, but they were still, silent, ominous. She took a shaky breath and stood up, her legs trembling beneath her. She had to get out of there. She had to escape before it came back. She stumbled out of the room and ran through the house, her flashlight beam dancing wildly. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she had to get away. She burst out of the front door and into the night, running as fast as she could. She didn't stop running until she reached her own house, several blocks away. She fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking so badly she could barely get them in the lock. She finally managed to unlock the door and stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind her. She leaned against the door, her chest heaving. She was safe. At least, she hoped she was. She glanced around her living room, her eyes scanning the shadows. Everything seemed normal, familiar, safe. But then, she saw it. A small, brightly colored plastic ball sitting on her coffee table, a ball from the fun zone. Sarah screamed, backing away from the table. No, it can't be. She grabbed the ball and threw it against the wall, her eyes filled with terror. The ball bounced off the wall and landed on the floor, rolling to a stop near her feet. She stared at the ball, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew what it meant. It hadn't left her alone. It had followed her home. She was still being watched. She was still being hunted. She was not safe, not anymore. She was alone, trapped in her own house with something she couldn't see, something she couldn't fight. She was trapped in a nightmare that would never end. And she didn't know what to do. Sarah didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside her window sent shivers down her spine. She kept the lights on, but even the bright glow couldn't dispel the darkness that had settled over her. She kept seeing the plastic ball, sitting innocently on her coffee table. It was a constant reminder of what had happened, of what she had lost. As the night wore on, strange things began to happen. She would catch glimpses of shadows moving in the corners of her eyes, shadows that seemed to writhe and twist on their own. She would hear faint whispers in the darkness, whispers that seemed to be calling her name. And then there was the smell, a faint, rotten smell that permeated the air, a smell like decaying plastic and something else, something she couldn't quite identify. It was the same smell that had filled the fun zone, the same smell that had clung to the ball pit. She tried to tell herself it was just her imagination, that she was just tired and scared. But she knew it was more than that. She knew that something was wrong, that something was in her house with her. She tried to convince herself to call the police, to tell them everything that had happened. But she was afraid. Afraid they wouldn't believe her. Afraid they would think she was crazy. And most of all, afraid of what might happen if she brought them into her nightmare. So she stayed silent, trapped in her own fear. She huddled in her bed, her eyes wide and unblinking, listening to the strange noises and waiting for something terrible to happen. She started seeing things out of the corner of her eye, shapes darting in the hallway when she walked by. She tried to tell herself it was just her eyes playing tricks on her. One morning, she went to make breakfast, and as she opened the fridge, the smell of rot nearly knocked her over. Everything in the fridge was fine. Nothing was expired. Still, that smell. She knew then she wasn't safe. It was inside the house. It was getting stronger, and she was running out of time. The next morning, Sarah woke up to a nightmare. She found one of the plastic balls in her bed. It was nestled beside her on the pillow, as if waiting for her to wake up. She screamed and threw it across the room. Then she saw another one. And another. They were everywhere. On her dresser, under her bed, in her closet. Small, brightly colored plastic balls scattered throughout her room, mocking her with their childish innocence. She frantically began to gather them up, throwing them into a garbage bag. But as fast as she threw them away, more appeared. It was as if they were multiplying, spreading throughout her house like a disease. She started finding them in other places too, in the kitchen, in the bathroom, in the living room. They were even in her food. She found one floating in her cereal bowl, another nestled in her sandwich. She was surrounded, trapped. There was no escape. She realized then that it wasn't just in her house, it was in her life. It was a part of her now. The ball pit hadn't let her go. It never would. She tried to burn the balls, but they wouldn't burn. They just melted, oozing a strange black goo that smelled even worse than the rot. She tried to smash them, but they were indestructible. They just bounced away, as if laughing at her. She was trapped, she was alone, and she was running out of options. Days turned into nights, each one more terrifying than the last. Sarah barely slept, afraid of what she might find when she woke up. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. The shadows grew darker, more menacing, and the plastic balls continued to multiply, filling her house with their silent, mocking presence. She was beginning to lose her mind. She was starting to see things, or were they just now revealing themselves? She wasn't sure of anything anymore, except that the fun zone wasn't done with her yet, and it wasn't going to let her go. Ever. One night, Sarah lay in bed, too afraid to sleep. The plastic balls were everywhere, scattered across her room like fallen stars. The whispers were constant now, a chorus of voices calling her name, beckoning her to join them. The rotten smell was almost unbearable, choking her with its stench. Suddenly, she heard a new sound. A faint sound coming from under her bed. At first, she thought it was just her imagination. But then she heard it again and again. It was the sound of children crying and laughing, giggling and sobbing, a cacophony of childish voices that sent shivers down her spine. She slowly reached for her flashlight, her hand trembling. She pointed the beam of light under her bed, her heart pounding in her chest. What she saw there would haunt her forever. The space under her bed was filled with plastic balls. Piles and piles of them, glowing faintly in the darkness, and nestled among the balls were small, shadowy figures that looked like children. The children were crying and laughing, their voices a chilling blend of joy and sorrow. Their eyes glowed with an eerie light, and their skin was pale and translucent. They reached out to her, their tiny hands beckoning her to join them. Their voices whispered her name, promising her peace, promising her oblivion. Sarah screamed, throwing the flashlight across the room. The light went out, plunging her into darkness. The crying and laughing grew louder, more insistent. The plastic bowls glowed brighter, filling the room with an eerie light. Sarah closed her eyes, bracing herself for the end. She knew what was coming. She knew that the ball pit had finally claimed her. The children's voices grew louder, closer. They were right beside her now, their icy fingers touching her skin. "Join us, Sarah," they whispered. "Join us forever." The last thing Sarah heard before the darkness consumed her was the sound of children laughing, and the faint but unmistakable sound of plastic balls shifting and swirling beneath her bed. The end?